Welcome to this episode of Just One Thing. In today's edition, I'm going to talk about the Windows Azure development environment and how you can get up and running to start coding for Windows Azure. My name is Adam Grocholski, and I'm a technical evangelist with RBA Consulting. So, of course, before you can really do anything, you need obviously a laptop, but once you have the laptop or desktop, whatever you're using, you need an operating system. And Windows Azure development only supports a few operating systems. First, Windows 7, any edition except the Basic Edition, Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2008 SP2, as well as Windows Vista SP2 or greater. So the key thing here to know is that Windows XP development is not supported and will not be supported. And the reason for that is that Windows Azure is dependent upon IIS 7.0, that's Internet Information Services 7.0 or greater, to host its web or worker roles, its compute instances. And IIS 7 does not run on Windows XP. In fact, it only runs on the operating systems you see above Windows XP on the slide here. Once you've got the OS in place and configured, you then have some prereqs. First, .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 or 4.0. Your Azure applications can target either. Obviously, my machine, I usually put both on there, so you need to make sure you have those. You then have to have Internet Information Services 7.0 installed on the machine. By default, when you install Windows, it doesn't install IIS. Same with Windows Server. You actually have to go in and in Windows 7 or Vista, you need to kind of install the IIS components. Windows Server, you need to enable the role. You then need Microsoft SQL Server Express 2005 or greater, so you can use 2008 or 2008 R2. And it doesn't have to be Express, it can be the developer edition. And the reason you need this on your machine is that when you're running and developing locally, the Azure SDK uses SQL Server to kind of mock storage in the cloud. So storage in the cloud, we have tables, queues, and blobs. On your local machine, SQL Server Express is used to simulate that storage environment. Also, obviously, Visual Studio 2010 to do any type of actual development. Once you have those prereqs in place, there's some just basic Azure components you need, and one is obviously the Windows Azure SDK. This includes the tools for Visual Studio, as well as a number of other tools. The simulator we'll take a look at in just a minute, and a number of things, Visual Studio templates, etc. And now if you're actually going to want to deploy out to the cloud, you'll actually need to get set up with a Windows Azure account as well. You can go to windows.azure.com and get your account set up today. And at that point, you're ready to start doing basic Azure development. However, there are some additional optional components you can install as well if you want to take advantage of other features of the platform. First, you have Windows Azure App Fabric. This SDK doesn't get installed as part of the Windows Azure SDK. It's a separate one, and there's two versions. 1.0 is the version of the SDK, the production version, so what's running in production now in the cloud, you can install that SDK. If you want to experiment with some of the new features of what they're working on in the lab environment, you can install the 2.0 version of the SDK that's currently in CTP. If you're going to be working with access control service, so securing your Azure-based resources using the Windows Azure app or the Windows Azure App Fabric ACS, there's a couple of components you need on your machine. You need Windows Identity Foundation and the Windows Identity Foundation SDK. This enables you to secure apps and develop with while running on your machine, so then you can deploy those components to the cloud and they'll be secure using ACS. Finally, if you're into mobile development and want to leverage the cloud, there's a couple of options for you. There's the Windows Azure Toolkit for Windows Phone and the Windows Azure Toolkit for iOS. The Toolkit for Windows Phone gives you a couple of additional project templates as well as some assemblies you can use to consume cloud-based resources on your Windows Phone 7 applications. That toolkit's available up on Codeplex. If you do iOS development, there's a Windows Azure Toolkit published by Microsoft as well for iOS developers to consume cloud-based resources, use notification services in your iPhone or iPad applications. That toolkit is available on GitHub. Alright, so once you have all that installed, I want to kind of take you through a run through of what the actual development environment looks like. Let's get out of the slides for a minute. And let's go into Visual. Why don't we start with Visual Studio? So I just got Visual Studio here open, not doing a whole lot. Well, let's add a new project. And this is the best way to tell if you've actually set up your environment correctly. add new project, and what you should see once the new project dialog pops up is an option for cloud. And in there, by default, if you just install the Windows Azure SDK, you'll see a Windows Azure project. If you install the Windows Azure Toolkit for Windows Phone, you'll see a couple of other options in there. So you'll see one for there's an empty one, and there's a cloud one that gives you a number of templated views and classes, etc. We'll just stick with the Windows Azure project, and I'll add this on my machine here. We'll just select a directory. Looks good. We'll go to more code. Alright, Windows Azure Project 10, and we'll click OK. Now at this point, there's a couple of other things that you're going to get prompted for. Specifically, when you create a Windows Azure project, you need to specify some roles, and you can add these roles later on as well, but when you're creating the project, it prompts you for them. So I can add a typical ASP.NET web role. I can add an MVC2 role. MVC3 is supported. It's not in this dialog box, but you can get MVC3 project up and working. If you're going to create a site that hosts WCF services, you can do that. Worker role, that's kind of the background processing jobs. There's a template for that. If you do PHP, I should say, you've got a template for the CGI web roles, as well as the Silverlight business app. So this helps create the Silverlight projects and the WCF RIA services and gets them all wired up as well. Of course, you can also use Visual Basic in the cloud, as well as Visual F Sharp for if you do kind of procedural based processing. You can use Visual F Sharp for your worker roles. But why don't we just take a typical web role? We'll add that. I'll name it here, and we'll say my awesome web role, and let's add that, and we'll see what we get. Now, what we'll see in the solution is Explorer is not one but two actual projects. So the first project here, this one that says Windows Azure Project 10, this is the cloud project. This is the Azure project itself. If we were to deploy this application, we would actually deploy this project. Similarly, we also have another project, and this is our ASP.NET project, My Awesome Web Role. Now, what you'll note here, what's really important to note as you're developing on your machine, is that the Azure project is set as the startup project. What will happen when we run this application is that our emulator will kick off, get up and running, and then deploy our, in this case, just our one web role to the emulator, to that simulated cloud environment on my local machine. I could set my ASP.NET project to be the startup project, but then it wouldn't be running in the cloud. It would just be running on my local IIS or my local dev server. So I wouldn't be able to access various features of the cloud, such as storage diagnostics, etc. So there we go. All right, so we're just going to run this as is. Actually, one more thing. We can take a look at this web role quick. If we double click on it, we see there's a number of configuration options here. What trust level do I want it to run in? By default, it's full trust. How many instances do I want to run? Keep that in mind when you're running on your local machine. Don't run too many because it'll kill your machine and kill performance. If I want diagnostics, and then there's settings, endpoints, and we'll talk a lot about these different things in future versions of just one thing. So with that, let's run the application and see what happens. So the first thing you'll note, and you'll see kind of, if you watch the very bottom of Visual Studio, you'll see the build starts and it succeeds, and then it goes through kind of this packaging and deployment process. What it's doing is imitating or kind of mimicking what it does when you deploy to the cloud. It creates a package, which is an encrypted zip file essentially, and then it deploys that out, in this case to my local machine. And you'll see here in your task, in your tray, this little Azure Windows icon to let you know that the emulators are starting up. So the tooling, the SDK, comes with a couple of emulators. It comes with a compute and a storage emulator. And we can take a look quickly at those. And they'll take a little bit to start up the first time when you run it. Let's see here, okay, storage emulator is running as well. We'll close that. But then what happens is, so eventually it's deploying out to the emulator, and what it does on your machine, you can actually take a look at it here. Go to Internet Information Services, you can kind of see what happens. Close that for a minute. Actually, okay, there's my website. You'll see here it's just running on my local host. By default, Windows Azure uses port 81 for everything. or for the compute instances, I should say. So, and there's my website. Nothing great there, but let's look at what's going on behind the scenes. So first, if I go into IIS, you'll see what it does. Every time you run a deployment, it actually creates a new site on your machine, and when you tear it down or when you stop debugging it, it gets deleted. The emulator handles all that for you. So it's actually running in IIS on your machine, creating new sites as needed. If I had multiple instances of the role, I'd see multiple sites in here. Minimize that. We can also go take a look at the emulator. So let's pop up the compute emulator. And this is a handy tool. You can actually manage what's going on your machine from this emulator or from this UI. So it takes a little while to spin up. What it basically does is show you how many deployments you may have running on a machine at any point in time and the instances of those deployments. But what you also get is the ability to kind of look at the diagnostics of this instance. So if you're doing a lot of diagnostics, doing trace.writeline, whatever you do, you can actually see that diagnostic information appear here. And you also see various diagnostic information that gets output by the fabric as well. So as it's deploying and starting things up, you can see what's going on. And if an error pops up, you can usually catch it in here as well. I can also stop these deployments from this window. I can restart them. I can delete them. I can refresh data, I can do multiple deployments. But let's stop this for the time being. And if we go back to our compute emulator, you'll see it's actually stopping and eventually it'll be deleted. There, it's deleted. I can go into IIS again. Refresh. And you'll see that site got deleted as well. So it's actually generating these sites on the fly and then cleaning up after itself when it's done. So the other emulator you have is a storage emulator, and I want to talk about that momentarily. The storage emulator UI isn't anything great. It just lets you know the various storage services are running. However, as you're using storage, you're probably going to add files and to blob storage and entities to tables, etc. And sometimes you want to clean that up. You can certainly do that from here by just hitting the reset button, and that'll basically wipe out any data you have in storage and kind of get you started from ground zero again. What that's doing behind the scenes is it's using SQL on your machine. So if we go to I'll connect to my local SQL Express. Now you'll notice here I'm actually running SQL Express. It doesn't have to be SQL Express, and the instance can be a default instance on your machine, or it can be a different named instance. It doesn't have to be SQL Express. But to work in that scenario, you need to use a tool that ships with the SDK called ds-init that enables you to specify a different instance of SQL. The important thing to note, though, is that it must be on your machine. The way this works is that it will not allow you to use SQL on another machine and kind of try to mimic the cloud in your own environment via multiple machines. It has to be running locally. But you'll see you'll get a database on here called Development Storage DB. And in there you can kind of go and look around at how they're trying to mock out storage with accounts and blobs and containers. Keep in mind, in the cloud, it's not actually using SQL Server, it's using some other mechanism, but at least on your machine, this is how they're doing it, so you can kind of play around with it and see what's going on. And that is it for this version of Just One Thing. Hopefully it gave you enough information to start getting up and running with the Windows and Azure development environment.